Victory Day, the unforgettable May 9th, 1945, in Moscow's Red Square. The Soviet people are jubilant. They've done what no one else in the world could accomplish. This documentary film describes the unprecedented heroism and valor of Soviet people who killed the fascist beast in his den. Berlin, May 1945. Hitler's Reichschancellery was already taken. This is Hitler's private office. And this is where the Nazi military elaborated their criminal plans to enslave the nations. Today, these plans are known to the whole world. First, occupy West Europe. Without power over Europe, we're nothing. Europe is Germany. Then, a blitz march against Russia. If we want to create a great German empire, we must exterminate the Slavic peoples. Next, through the Middle East, blows at Britain, India, Canada. Britain must be struck at her weak points, India and Canada. Next, on to Africa via the Mediterranean. Africa must be a German dominion. Then, across the ocean to the Western Hemisphere. Germany would be great and rich after seizing Mexico's mines. Why shouldn't we do that? And finally, get to the United States. Defeat the Anglo-Saxons, and then incorporate the United States in Germany's world empire. These were not only dreams. Landing forces were dropped in northern Norway. After seizing Europe, the Nazi armored forces invaded Africa and approached Alexandria. Their submarines sunk shipping off the American coast. Hitler imagined himself to be conqueror of the world. He was even prepared to share part of the glory with his Italian ally Mussolini. Many people thought at the time that there was no force capable of halting his armies. But Moscow rose in their way. Then Stalingrad. The Red Army drove them back from the Volga. It drove them across the Don River. The Nazis abandoned thousands of guns and tanks on the battlefields. When retreating across the Desna, they burnt villages and blew up factories. The Red Army drove the Nazi killers across the Dnieper. It drowned them in the Bug River. It encircled and destroyed them. The Dwina was left behind. The Nazis were thrown back across the Neman. Liberated Soviet territory lay behind. But ahead, the enslaved nations of Europe awaited liberation. The Vistula. The enemy had been swept back and destroyed. The Red Army approached the last water barrier in front of Berlin. The Red Army had reached the Oder. This is the Oder. Behind lay 4 years of war, 4 hard years of battles and great victories. The Red Army had reached this point wiser with the experience of war, hardened and strong, and ready as never before to strike the last crushing blow at the enemy. The Germans called the Oder the river of their destiny. Now the destiny of this river was in the hands of the Russian soldier. In his retreat, the enemy had blown up the bridges. Preparations were underway to force the Oder. Only 75 kilometers remained to Berlin, but every one of them would have to be taken in battle. After forcing the Oder, the first line of defense had to be overcome. Pillboxes and fortified emplacements built for long-term resistance. Beyond them lay the Zelo Heights with their impassable terrain. Tank maneuvering and fighting was particularly difficult here. This was the second line of defense. Trenches stretching many kilometers and strongly fortified positions. There were anti-tank ditches and minefields everywhere, forest blocks, canals and lakes, centers of resistance and populated points. The Soviet command had prepared for the decisive battle long before the start of the operation. Hundreds of such trainloads were dispatched into the forest. Thousands of tons of fuel were cached in underground storage tanks. At the same time, fresh forces were pulled up to the western bank of the Oder. The weapons for a strike of tremendous force had to be concentrated here, on this tiny strip of land won from the enemy. The offensive against Berlin would start from this bridgehead. Before the offensive, the Military Council conferred with the command of the units attached to the 1st Belarusian Front. The briefing was attended by generals who had fought in the great battles at Moscow, Stalingrad, Kursk, and Oryol. They had fought for Gomel, Bobruisk, and Vitebsk. They had liberated Poland, Lublin, Warsaw, and Poznan. They had led their troops up to the Oder. The task facing them now was to seize the capital of Nazi Germany. This was the operations plan. The troops of the First Belarusian Front were to deliver the main strike, approach Berlin, and encircle it. The troops of the First Ukrainian Front were to push ahead to meet the Allies and simultaneously back the operation from the south. The troops of the Second Belarusian Front were to force the Oder and back the offensive from the north. Everything was ready for the decisive offensive. Quiet fell on the bridgehead. On April the 16th, at 4 a.m., 22,000 guns hit the enemy defenses. This was an artillery offensive of unprecedented force. Soon the artillery strike was strengthened by bomber aircraft. In the first hours of the offensive, breaches were blasted in the reinforced defensive zone and tanks moved into them. At the same time, troops of the First Ukrainian Front went into action, with Marshal Konyev leading his forces into the offensive. The enemy had set up 4 strong defense lines between the Oder and Berlin. Each of them was intended for long resistance. The Hitlerites had removed forces from the Western Front and dispatched them to the east. They had concentrated an army of 500,000 men here. This was the German defense plan. And this was the plan of the Red Army's offensive. That day, these plans came to grips on the battlefield. Troops of the Second Belarusian Front materialized the plan elaborated by the command and forced the Oder north of the direction of the main strike. The enemy tried to prevent the crossing, but the superiority of the Soviet Air Force was overwhelming. Scores of Nazi planes were shot down in air battles and by AA fire. These attack planes backed the Soviet offensive by smashing enemy strongholds and reserves on all roads up to Berlin. In a short period of time, the Zalo heights were passed, the dense network of canals and lakes was overcome, and the strongholds and centers of resistance were hammered flat. On April the 21st, the Soviet forces reached Berlin. There it was. This was not the first time that Russian troops had stood at the walls of the city. In 1760, Berlin capitulated without fighting to the troops of General Chernyshov. The Russian troops had entered Berlin with these banners, which are now treasured as relics. These horns had heralded the bloodless victory over Berlin. This is the act of capitulation that the Germans signed in 1760, when they surrendered and saved their capital from destruction. But the Hitlerites had decided otherwise. Defensive lines had been put up well in advance around and in Berlin. Secret orders regarding the defense of Berlin stipulated, defend every block, every house, every floor, every ruin, every meter of land. Turn German soil into hell for the Bolsheviks.
Berlin kapituliert nicht. Ich werde diesen Häuserblock verteidigen lassen. Das ist unser Gebet und Rache unser Geldgeschrei. Wir müssen ein Volk der Fanatiker werden. Es beginnt ein Kampf, Mann gegen Mann, wieder und wieder.
This was how the battle for Berlin started. Heavy fighting broke out immediately in the suburbs. Up to then, the Berliners had judged of the war from the boastful communiques of Goebbels. But now the war was raging right in Berlin. By ordering Berlin to be turned into hell for the Bolsheviks, the criminal Hitler command had turned it into hell for the German population of the city. Fear drove people down into the cellars, and hunger drove them out into the streets. Fear and hunger were all that Hitler gave the Germans instead of the promised benefits. This unmatched battle for every house, for every street and every ruin was in its third day. The fighting moved from the suburbs closer to the center. The fighting became fiercer with every day. The troops tore ahead through burning houses and over ruins and rubble. Their steady advance could not be stopped. Many Hitlerites realized this and surrendered. On the 25th of April, Berlin was surrounded. Troops of the 1st Belarusian Front linked up with those of the 1st Ukrainian Front and closed the ring around Berlin. By that time, the situation was as follows. Kuznetsov's army was pressing on the center of Berlin from the north. Berzarin's army was fighting its way to the center from the east. But here, the enemy was putting up particularly strong resistance. Chulkov's army was fighting its way to Tempelhof. Marshal Konyev's forces were continuing to approach from the south and southwest. There was fighting in hundreds of streets, where every building was a latent ambush and blow from behind. From the very first days, the commandant of Berlin, Colonel General Berzarin, had called on the population to return the city to normal life. The Germans obeyed the orders of the Soviet command and took apart the barricades and blocks, clearing the way to the center of the capital for the Soviet tanks. Not long before that, they were throwing flowers under the treads of the German tanks bound for the east. The German people had been brought up for centuries in a spirit of reverence for the military. The clanking of spurs and the rattle of sabers aroused their admiration. This Soviet woman soldier had a big account to settle with the Hitlerites. But the Red Army did not take revenge on civilians. It did not kill women and children. It fed them. What did this woman get from Hitler and his criminal plans for world domination? These men were lucky. They managed to surrender. But there could be no mercy for those who continued to resist and prepare a treacherous stab in the back. This is Tempelhof, Berlin's central airfield. German planes were still burning, and artillery shelling was still in progress when Soviet flyers landed on the airfield. This is Major Kurtbrest, former commandant of the airfield, who had now become a prisoner of war. The major recalled more joyful days. Goering used to take the salute at parades here and decorate his aces. The major had received his first cross from Goering here. But more sorrowful recollections followed. Once they flew Benito Mussolini in. He had just been abducted from his captors. Hitler met his friend in distress here. The Tempelhof airfield was left far behind. The artillery was now shelling the very heart of Berlin. The fighting was in its 7th day, and it continued at night with the same intensity. Berlin burned, but the Berliners were long used to the pungent smoke of fires. Hitler had set fire to the Reichstag here to start the conflagration that enveloped the whole world. On these bonfires, the Nazis had burned the greatest creations of the human intellect. Hitler's cutthroats had marched with torches here. This was where the future death camp killers were brought up, the executioners of Majdanek, Oswiecim, and Treblinka. The men who burnt peaceful Soviet towns and villages had started their march through Europe from here. And this fire of war, which had been ignited here in Berlin, had returned to Berlin. The Russian soldiers were already fighting in the very center of Berlin. Scenes like this could be observed in the city, although the Soviet command had made looting strictly punishable in the interests of the Berliners themselves. The 8th day was rounding out. It was painful to lose one's buddies in those last hours with victory so close. Chuikov's guards units broke into the center of the city from the southeast. From the north, Kuznetsov's army was pressing towards the Reichstag. It had already taken the prison where the German anti-fascists were incarcerated. In the east, Berzarin's army was fighting. The First Army of the Polish forces, under the command of General Poplavsky, took part in the storming of Berlin. The ring around the center of the city was tightening. That was the Reichstag beyond the cathedral. battle had reached its pitch. Even in the midst of this intense fighting, the Russian soldier retained a feeling of pity and magnanimity. Some of the soldiers had already been near the Reichstag. The Reichstag was close by now. Next to it was the Brandenburg Gate. This was the site of the former triumphs of the Friedrichs and the Wilhelms, of the Prussian kings and German emperors. Not long before, the bloated Nazi glory had drummed its way throughout the world from here. Now, that was all over with. Only 200 meters remained to the Reichstag. Everyone had but one thought, one desire, to place the banner of victory on top of the Reichstag. To place the banner of victory on top of the Reichstag. To place the banner of victory on top of the Reichstag. And the banner of victory was planted on top of the Reichstag. May the 2nd, 1945. This was a date that would go down in history. Berlin capitulated. The Hitlerites surrendered and cast their weapons down before the Red Army. They ended their last battle ingloriously. They had claimed that the Russians would never be in Berlin, and 10 days later, they surrendered their capital. 10 days. This is insignificant if we remember the heroic defense of Leningrad, Sevastopol, and Stalingrad. On May the 2nd, 130,000 officers and men surrendered in Berlin. This inscription reads, "Capitulate? No." But the white flags of capitulation hung from these windows. Many of them had pledged allegiance to Hitler. This is Artillery General Weidling, commander of Berlin's defenses. On May the 2nd, he signed the order of capitulation and surrendered together with his staff. This wasn't what they had hoped to witness.
На допросе генерал...
Artillery General Weidling had been received by Hitler on April the 29th, and Hitler had continued to insist on resistance.
29 апреля, и Гитлер продолжал настаивать на сопротивлении.
Gleichzeitig von Norden, Gruppe Steiner, also Herr Fürstenberg.
Гитлер рассчитывал,
He had thought that the German Ninth Army, operating southeast of Berlin, and the army operating opposite the Allies, southwest of Berlin, supported by the Panzer Army, would encircle and smash the Soviet forces.
и разобьют советские войска.
Значит, генерал Вейдлинг видел...
So General Weidling saw Hitler personally on April the 29th. Ask him what Hitler looked like and what sort of a state he was in.
Пожалуйста.
Sagen Sie bitte, wie sah Hitler aus und in welchem Zustand befand er sich?
Ich habe in meinem Leben einmal dem Führer gegenübergestanden.
I had seen the Führer a year before that. I was shocked when I saw him this time. This was a wreck of a man.
Это была развалина.
Das war der Mann geworden eines körperlichen Lebens. Er saß tief eingesunken in seinem Stuhl, die Hände...
Он сидел совершенно...
He sat absolutely crushed in his armchair, and his hands hung limply over the map. He spoke in a barely audible voice, and he stammered.
Это был
He was
конченый
finished. On that same day, the corpse of Goebbels was found and identified. Goebbels was silent. His Ministry of Propaganda had been destroyed. His radio station was silent. He had poisoned the world for many years from here with his preaching of brute force and hatred for man. In the streets of Berlin, the victors met liberated Americans, Britons, Frenchmen, Belgians, Poles, and Norwegians. Meet traffic monitor Lydia Spivak at the Brandenburg Gate. Our cameraman asked her for permission to take these shots and to tell them about her background.
Что я могу сказать? В Берлине, в центре. Другой раз так забудешь. Не вдумаешься глубоко.
It's great that we're already in Berlin, right opposite the Reichstag, facing the Brandenburg Gate.
Ебель за камнем, который
The fascists tried to stop us, but we made it.
Ну кто я? Простая деревенская девушка.
I'm just an ordinary country girl.
В школе 10 лет.
I went to school. Then, when the war broke out, I joined the army.
Пошла уже великий путь. Пошла путь через всю
I
Украину.
crossed the Ukraine to Crimea and came right up to Berlin. The men and their commanders posed for these pictures at the Reichstag. They will be a memory of the great victory over fascist Germany. The Battle of Berlin had a decisive impact on the fighting in Europe. The German war machine was smashed and proved incapable of further resistance. Germany capitulated. On May the 8th, a delegation of the Supreme Command of the Allied Expeditionary Forces arrived at the Tempelhof airfield. That was the day set for Germany to sign the Act of Unconditional Capitulation. Lieutenant General Vasiliev met the arrivals. Air Chief Marshal Sir Arthur Tedder, head of the delegation, and General Karl Spaatz, commander of the United States Strategic Air Force. the guests were greeted by Army General Sokolovsky. Representatives of Hitler's command were also flown into Berlin to sign the Act of Unconditional Capitulation. They were headed by General Field Marshal Keitel. Keitel and his party were led to the cars where they would have to wait until the end of the ceremony in honor of the Allied victors. Keitel had yet another look at the terms of capitulation. Keitel traveled through Berlin again. But this was no longer the same Berlin, nor the same Keitel. The cavalcade drove from Tempelhof through the entire city to Karlshorst on the outskirts. This is Karlshorst, and this unassuming building would make history that day. The Act of Unconditional Capitulation would be signed here. The representatives of the Allied command call on Marshal Zhukov. Keitel and his party were taken to a house where they would wait until they were summoned. At the appointed hour, the representatives of the Soviet and Allied commands appeared in the hall. The signing would take place in the presence of numerous representatives of the command of the front and guests from the Allied powers. Marshal Zhukov informed the whole that representatives of Hitler's command had arrived in Berlin, and he summoned the German delegation to sign the Act of Unconditional Capitulation. Even at this critical moment for them, they tried to retain their usual Prussian haughtiness. In reply to Marshal Zhukov's question whether the representatives of the German command were acquainted with the terms of capitulation, Keitel replied in the affirmative. Marshal Zhukov called on the representatives of the German command to come up to the table and sign the act of unconditional capitulation. On behalf of the High Command of the Armed Forces of Germany, the act of capitulation was signed by General Field Marshal Keitel. Hitler and Goebbels had claimed that 1918 would never be repeated. It was not. Then the armistice and the peace treaty were signed not by Hindenburg, not by the German military, not by Ludendorff, but by civilians. This time, 3 German commanders affixed their signatures in the capital of Germany to a document conceding complete defeat. The act of capitulation was signed by Admiral Friedenberg. It was signed by Colonel General Stumpf, representing the German Air Force. The act of capitulation was signed by representatives of the victorious powers. The first to sign was the representative of the Soviet command. The biggest trials and tribulations in the war fell to the lot of the Red Army. It heroically passed this test with flying colors. Also perpetuated on the glorious pages of the war are the exploits of the British, the American, and the French fighting men, comrades in arms of the Soviet troops. The act of capitulation was signed. The German representatives left the hall. The German military went into battle twice for world domination and was beaten both times, under the sign of the Prussian eagle and under the banner of the fascist swastika. Berlin. The Hitlerites wanted it to stand up in glory over the ruins of a vanquished world. These were criminal ambitions. How much blood and tears they caused humanity, including the German people. These ruins are a grim reminder and a stern warning to those who would like to turn the world into a shambles for a third time. This inscription reads, "Berlin will remain German." Yes, it will remain German, but it will never be fascist. These inscriptions, left by Soviet soldiers, will never be obliterated from history.
number of crematories is increased, and extermination continues at an appalling rate. In the concentration camp of Auschwitz alone, the Nazis eliminate 6,000 Jews per day. This genocide continues until the end of the war, by which time 6 million Jews will have been exterminated. On June 6, 1944, the Allies land in Normandy. The Germans are engaged in two fronts and suffer serious setbacks. On July 20th, 1944, Colonel von Stauffenberg and others try to assassinate Hitler. This attempt fails, and Hitler takes refuge in his bunker. The German army is destroyed. Hitler is forced to call to arms old men and young boys. Hitler's last hope is the use of his secret weapons, the V-1 and V-2 rockets. The Germans cannot stop the American and English troops on the Western Front and the Russian forces on the Eastern Front. Hitler makes a final appearance to the public and withdraws to his bunker for the last time. His two remaining acts are to marry his mistress, Eva Braun, and to name Admiral Donitz as his successor. Accepting defeat, Hitler makes his farewells to his few remaining followers. On April 30th, 1945, Hitler shoots himself and Eva Braun takes poison. According to his instructions, their bodies are burned.
Benito Mussolini was born in 1883 in Predappio, Italy. Before graduation, barely 17 years old, he joins the Socialist Party. In 1902, to avoid the draft, he goes to Switzerland, where he stays for 2 years. He returns to teach and collaborate with the socialist newspapers of that time. At the age of 26, he is engaged to Rachele Guidi. He will marry in 1915. In 1910, he participates in popular demonstrations, and in December 1912 becomes editor of the Socialist Party's official newspaper, Avanti. At the beginning of the First World War, he assumes a neutral position. Subsequently, he starts a new daily, Il Popolo d'Italia. Expelled from the Socialist Party, he creates the Union of the Revolutionary Action and answers the call to arms. After the war, he returns to Milan as publisher of Il Popolo d'Italia. He entices his followers, as well as students, to take the workers' places during strikes, taking advantage of unrest and the people's discontent with the existing political regime. On the 23rd of March, 1919, in the Piazza San Sepolcro, he creates the first nucleus of the Fascist Party. He expresses his aversion to the democratic institutions, and with the help of industrial capital and good luck, he's elected to the Chamber of Deputies in 1921. In November 1921, he has a mass meeting in Naples. The National Fascist Party of Black Shirts consolidates. Popular acceptance and large followings convince Mussolini he is on the right track to gain absolute power. He marches on Rome the 28th of October, 1922. He arrives in the capital, followed by his fascist followers from every corner of Italy. He gains the support of the army, as well as King Victor Emmanuel III. And on the 30th of October, he is given the order to form a new government. In the beginning, Mussolini is cautious, and he seeks the cooperation of other political parties. Gradually, however, he consolidates his rule under a dictatorship. In January of 1923, he establishes the Gran Consiglio and establishes one Italy with one party. The fascists are in control. Various politicians accept Mussolini's action. Only one opponent, Deputy Giacomo Matteotti, denounces the fascist leader. Matteotti is assassinated the 24th of June, 1924. Still, the various parties are passive to Mussolini's action, and the king reconfirms his trust in Il Duce. With new laws established in 1925 and 1926, the fascist leader gains supreme powers. By the end of 1926, he abolishes all other political parties. He creates a special tribunal as a tool to eradicate all his opponents. In 1929, he creates the bilateral pacts to establish the relation between church and state. Mussolini creates the working card in 1927, which puts the country's economy completely under his control. With his penchant for eloquent speeches, he becomes more and more popular. He travels throughout the country giving speeches, enticing farmers and workers. Mussolini speaking to the workers of Fiat. It has been 10 years since we have seen each other. Now we are united together. We have the total approval of all the workers of all of Italy. In celebration of these first 10 years, we give birth to the new generation.
Non solo voi, ma tutti, sono pienamente convinti che questo non è che il primo decennio, al quale ne seguiranno perlomeno 9.
Mussolini congratulates Italio Balbo for the first transatlantic crossing. It's the time of grand speeches and the birth of new cities. He dedicates Littoria. Then in Sardinia, new cities are born: Fertilia, Carbonia, Mussolinia. In foreign affairs, he opposes Hitler's ideas of annexation of Austria. The meeting between the two dictators is cold. Mussolini is on the side of England and France, and with ministers Laval and MacDonald, signs the Pact of Stresa. Driven by his desires to conquer and expand and encouraged by the condescending attitude of the democratic countries, he prepares to occupy Ethiopia. In October of 1935, he declares war. Mussolini salutes the troops embarking for East Africa. The League of Nations, calling it a war of aggression, imposes economic sanctions against Italy. Mussolini responds, mobilizing the working nation to be self-sufficient. To support the nation's economy, he organizes a national campaign to collect the nation's metals and personal gold. Fortunately, the war is brief. The enemy has not enough arms to oppose a well-equipped army. In May 1936, the Italian people gather to hear the victory from Il Duce. Men and women of Italy, Italians and friends of Italy, listen to the telegram from our Marshal Badoglio.
Il maresciallo Badoglio telegrafa. Oggi, 5 maggio.
Today, the 5th of May, at 1600 hours, leading our victorious troops, I entered Addis Ababa.
Sono entrato in Addis Abeba.
Italy has an empire, and Mussolini wants it to be fascist. At this time, the Italian dictatorship comes closer to the German dictatorship of the Führer and sides with him in the Spanish Civil War. Many Italians, opposing fascism, fight on the opposite side. Fascism is coming into its own. Hitler, taking advantage of his new alliance during the Spanish Civil War, works hard to cement their relations. There are many exchange visits between the two military leaders. In 1936, Hitler and Mussolini formed the Rome-Berlin alliance. Later, in 1939, in Munich, the Pact of Steel, a strong alliance between Italy and Germany. In 1939, Hitler starts World War II. Mussolini abstains from the conflict, and on September 1st, 1939, declares Italy's neutrality. The rapid victory of the German army over various European nations induces Mussolini to abandon his neutrality. The sudden change in politics leaves Italy confused. On the 10th of June, 1940, Italy declares war. The Italian soldiers, ill-equipped, ill-prepared, and disorganized, begin to suffer early in the conflict. The people don't relish this war. Mussolini tries to rally them with reports of the early Axis victories. The war seems to drag. Germany is suffering defeat on all European fronts, and now faces defeat in Africa. The situation is becoming critical. The fascist party is losing faith in Il Duce. On the 15th of July, 1943, the king orders Mussolini's arrest, and the government is given to Marshal Badoglio. On September 29th, Badoglio's government signs the armistice, and on October 13th declares war on Germany. Mussolini is imprisoned, first on the island of Ponza, then on the island of Maddalena, finally to Gran Sasso. At Gran Sasso, Mussolini is freed by German paratroopers, and Mussolini is taken to Germany and meets with Hitler. From Germany, Mussolini creates the basis of the Italian Socialist Republic, with its government headquarters at Rocca delle Cavanate near Forli on September 23, 1943. General Graziani is placed in charge of the fascist Republican Army. In Rome, he honors the tomb of the unknown soldier. The Italian flag flies without the emblem of the Royal House of Savoy. At the end of September, the new Republican government moves into northern Italy and intensifies recruiting. Italy is divided. Badoglio's government on the Allies' side, Mussolini's puppet regime on the Axis side. Mussolini tries to revive Italy's old glory. The Nazis impose a dictatorial regime enforcing obedience by force, extermination, and concentration camps. Partisans against the Nazi fascist regime are mercilessly shot. At the Lyric Theater in Milan, on the 16th of December, 1944, Mussolini delivers one of his last speeches. The Italian people have not betrayed their Axis allies. Again, in Milan, in April, he tries to obtain support. On April 24th, 1945, he's last seen in the courtyard of Milan's police headquarters. He's leaving for Como and refuge in Switzerland. The World War is ending.